Here we go again. La Nina is back. A La Nina advisory has been issued as we're watching these waters get cooler here in the Eastern Pacific. We'll talk about how that will impact winter. Also, we're watching what's going on in the North Pacific. An update on the cold that's building across Siberia. That cold and snow will have an impact across North America. We'll dive into the latest. And there's a chance for some snow in the upcoming week across North America. We'll show you where and where that cold air is headed. And an overall look at what I think winter's going to do. Here's where the cold air is right now. We've got a chunk of it breaking off into parts of western Canada. It'll impact parts of Montana and Idaho as we head into the week with some snow here into the mountains. But the real cold building across Siberia, also here across the ice pack of the North Pole area. And we're starting to see that cold air spill off of Greenland too as we cool down what's happening in the northern hemisphere. We're going to start in Siberia where a massive area of high pressure is building. This is a dry, arid environment, and this is where the cold air builds that will eventually impact us, likely here in North America. And there's a correlation between how much snowpack you build across this region and how winters may play out. Because the colder you get it here, you would obviously have more cold air to tap into and bring across the North Pole as we head into the winter. I think this winter is going to be different too, with a lot of fluctuations in the jet stream. That's going to really help pull some of this cold air across. Notice how below normal temperatures are expected. Now we're getting into late October. Even though it's going to start to get a little bit above average here across the high latitudes, it's almost too late at this point because we've already got snow on the ground. This is a look at temperatures, actual air temperatures. If it's below freezing, you're seeing this sort of bluish, icy color here. Look at the numbers, barely getting above freezing, even pretty far south here. So there's a lot of cold air across Asia right now. And underneath this surface high, it's relatively dry. All the precipitation really skirting around it. So not a lot of snow expected here, but there is some in the forecast. Another thing too that I really want to keep an eye on, because if you get it cold over here, you've got to bring that cold air across the North Pole into North America. And if it's moving across open water, which it would have been open at this point in time last year, just north of Alaska, there's a little bit more ice, a little more southerly extent, and we're starting the refreezing process across the Arctic Sea right now as we head into winter. This will continue to propagate south as we move through the winter, and that's going to allow this cold air to really not modify as much and spill down into North America. And with this type of setup, and this is what a typical La Nina winter looks like, if it were like this, you could see how that cold air could really move down into the lower 48. Now, this is the overall trend in a La Nina year. That doesn't mean you're not going to get an eventual storm or two that really taps into some of this cold air, which I think is going to start to move into North America, into Western Canada, and get pulled into. Another thing with this type of setup that we're seeing as a weak La Nina develops, typically it's wetter across the Pacific Northwest as you get a pretty active Pacific jet, or at least polar jet. Something we're starting to see is the difference in temperature across Siberia, where it's really cold. Water temperatures above average. So I'm going to go back to this map, and we want to talk about how this will impact our storms and potentially our storm track heading into the winter. Things are still looking favorable in my mind for these big Aleutian lows. It's getting really cold up here across Siberia. Again, remember that water is above average right here into the North Pacific. So these huge lows are wrapping up right along that thermal boundary, and they could be pretty strong. And I think that's going to start to displace some of this colder air that builds across Alaska, although it's pretty cold now. And it's going to push it down into North America. Someone commented on these videos, a lot of I thinks in this video. This is all my opinion, guys, right? So again, these are just overall weighted trends. I think you have to pay attention to each individual storm, and it's going to be a stormy one this winter, in my opinion. I'll be tracking storms all winter, so come back and subscribe if you like these winter weather outlooks. I have one every week. Another one's coming next week, and then we'll start to narrow those down with the weekly update with the winter storms that are ahead. And there are some on the way this upcoming week, so we're going to kind of dive into that just a little bit too. But overall, again, remember, if you're pushing that warm air into Alaska, you can see how I think this could be really interesting for the northern plains. Now, it may actually end up being drier here with the northwest flow overall. I think you're still going to get some storms. One area to watch, I think, is going to be right here into parts of the Midwest, maybe the upper Midwest into the Ohio Valley. If it's wetter than normal, you've got a lot of cold air moving in, it could be a little snowier than normal, and that could maybe even spill into parts of the Northeast. Whereas down into the South, who knows if you're going to get another Gulf Coast snowstorm again. The overall trend, though, for the South and into the Southeast is for drier and warmer conditions with a La Nina setup. I will say, this is a relatively weak La Nina event, so that map may not have as much impact. I think potentially what's going on here in the North Pacific may have a greater impact than a weak La Nina. And again, I think that displaces cold from Alaska, and it really pushes our storm track not only into the northwest, but it pulls that cold air into North America. Take a look at what's happening in the upcoming week. Of course, we've been talking about this big coastal low. Everyone's looking at that as we head through the week, but some cold air back across western Canada. We've got our first chance of significant snow across parts of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, rain to snow, but then that warm Pacific air starts to build back in and it sort of pushes that cold air north. This is something that I think, I don't want to say ruin winter for those of you who love winter, but if you get a screaming Pacific jet here, you're going to lock that cold air into the Arctic, and it's not going to be able to move very far to the south. That's kind of what we're seeing as we head into the week. Another upper low starts to spin into parts of California. That could actually bring some mountain snow. Pretty high elevation. Otherwise, the cold continues to build across the Arctic. Another storm moving into Alaska. And look, things to me look pretty stormy across this part of North America for the upcoming week. And hey, it's still fall, guys, so don't get ahead of it. We've got a lot of warm weather ahead. I think it's going to get pretty warm across the central U.S. this upcoming week. Another storm possibly wrapping up, a decent mid-latitude cyclone with some wind, some rain for western Canada, and that's going to tug some more cold air down, I think, as we head into next weekend for parts of the northern Rockies. Otherwise, relatively warm as we head east all the way through the 20th, but boy, a pretty strong low is showing up. That would be one heck of a wind maker, still pretty far clearly out on that. Looking at the temperatures, at least in the short term for the next 30 days or so, we're pretty warm here, again, across the central U.S. into parts of the east, but colder than average. I think that shows that early start to winter across the mountains in the west. And remember, we're watching that October snow into parts of Asia. While it is relatively cold now, the overall trend will be for things to get a little bit above average. However, remember, by this point, we're into November. Above average isn't much in Siberia in the late part of November into December. As winter settles in, if anything, if it starts to get above average here, that cold gets pushed somewhere else. And that's usually across the North Pole into North America. A quick look over at Europe, because I think this is also a place we'll look as we head into the winter. Usually when it gets cold in Europe, you start to see that in North America. As we head into November, the overall trend, at least for a lot of Eastern Europe especially, is to be warmer than average. And even though it's above average in the high latitudes, the European ensembles are still showing the chance of quite a bit of snow over the next several weeks as we head into November. And as you push this out seasonally, it starts to get colder. So those chances for snow, at least the line, starting to move further and further south. A long way to go with this forecasting. And to me, overall, I think it's colder than it was last year. It's stormier than it was last year. And there's some reflections of 2013 and 2014 in the outlook. That was a cold year, and I think we're kind of headed in that way. We had a warm North Pacific, and some of that is reflected again this year. So hit subscribe, follow along. If you're brand new, I'm Travis. I used to be a chief meteorologist. I worked in TV for years, so if you're looking for a weather source, I'd appreciate a sub. Come back. See you next time.